There once was a village next to a forest, and there lived a boy a long, long time ago who hated his voice more than anything in the world. Everyone who knew him knew he was a boy without a shadow of a doubt, but those not close were not so sure. Every day this boy thought to himself, if only I sounded like a boy, everything would be fixed. For this was his problem. His voice was much too high and shy, and of such a girlish way no matter how he looked at first, once he spoke everyone referred to him as such. And this was the way it was ever since he had grown past being a child. As he grew older, this problem became more and more apparent. He was getting to the age where the other boys were becoming strong and broad, and he wished for nothing other than for this one thing to be changed. Sometimes it was so distressing he didn't speak for days on end, but most of the time he was very talkative and cursed the words that did not sound right for spilling out of his mouth. But he could not help his nature, and the words came whether he liked them or not, and he often did not, as they did not sound like him. But the worst thing of all was that he loved to sing. He loved it and hated it like nothing else, for when he was alone, it was practically the only thing he did to keep himself entertained. He hummed while doing the chores, made up melodies to sing while out gathering. Every spare moment alone opened his mouth to a high, clear tune like the birds overhead, at the quietest volume he could manage, and it brought him such joy and peace. But he dreaded the moment someone startled him. If someone came upon him, he instantly snapped his mouth shut, and his skin flooded with hot embarrassment that someone heard, or worse, commented on it. They usually said his voice was beautiful, and he wanted to take that word and splinter it into 1,000 pieces like the wood he chopped with all the fervor he harbored, like how his heart felt when even his closest friends commented on his songs. So on and on it went, day after day, someone calling boy to him, and once he responded, quickly changing their minds. And every time it hurt like a dagger in his heart, spilling red shame all the way down his front. One day, when he felt as if he had been bled dry and had nothing left, that if it happened one more time he would simply crumble away, he knew something had to be done. But what? As he pondered, his eyes wandered to the dark forest that the children had been forbidden from ever since they could listen, and even before. Only the skilled men were allowed to go inside to hunt, and when a child dared step one length from the village toward it to peer inside, their ears were pulled nearly from their head, and the lesson was learned. So he had never even considered nearing the looming shadows within the trees, being the good rule follower he was. And yet, he thought of the reason why they were forbidden. His parents and elders had told of horrible beasts that would rip you to shreds without a thought, fairies that would steal your face and your name if you stepped into their magic circles, and witches that would curse you blind and deaf to wander the forest until your feet wore to bone. The familiar chill snaked up his spine when thinking of these stories, but a more sinister chill started in his clenching fingers and ran up his veins. The witches could curse you, but what if they could cast a different spell instead? But why would they? The hags lived in the dark forest away from the peace of the village for a reason. They must be evildoers. As the sun set, he turned away, and that night he laid his head to rest, rubbing his pendant necklace, thinking of what magic lurked in those shadows. Before he knew why, he had spent the whole day without a single word, and found himself staring into the woods every other moment. And then he was against the side of a house on the edge of the village facing the forest, and the only thing between him and those shadows were 100 paces of grass. He peered around the corner toward the village square, and at the thought of the confused eyes of someone hearing the dissonance of how he sounded and how he looked, his stomach clenched so painfully it felt like sharp fingers twisting a wet rag. He took a short, stilted breath, checked that there was no one else around, and sprinted towards the forest. A pace before his toes touched the shadows he stopped, fear shaking his bones and turning his legs weak. Steeling himself, he stepped into the trees. Expecting his limbs rent from his body in the next moment, his fists clenched and heart thumped in his ears, but as his eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, he was surprised to find he was still in one piece. It was quieter than the village, lacking not only the chatter of people but animals too. He only heard the faint chirping of birds from high up, and this regained some strength to his limbs. Taking a deep breath and a moment to gather all his courage, he continued deeper into the woods. Soon he found a path and followed it religiously, thinking it must be from the village hunters. But then doubt clouded him, and he wondered what would happen if he ran into any of them here. What they would do besides drag him back to the village, voice still attached. But he decided the risk was worth it to have a path to follow back, and kept alert for any footsteps, human or other. The path seemed to stretch on for hours, and he wondered how long it had been. It was much darker under the canopy of leaves, so it was harder to tell the sun's position in the sky, but he found he liked it. He felt comforted and hidden by the trees. If anyone came across him, he could easily dive in and hide in the greenery. As he walked and walked as the day passed on, he started to worry if anyone would miss him. But his mind in response thought he'd rather they miss him than hear him like this again. And as he walked, he started to doubt if there were even any witches at all, as he had not come across any beasts or monsters or fairies to steal him away. But he could not turn back now, not like this, not without answers, so on he went. At the moment he thought he must turn back if he didn't want to be caught still in the woods when the world turned dark. He didn't want to imagine how blinding it must be without even the moon's light. He came across a small clearing, and in that clearing was a small hut. His heart leaped and skipped in excitement and in fear, and he swallowed thickly. Part of him had started to believe that all those stories were just that, but this little house was exactly like the witch's hut the elders described. And when a shiny little black cat slinked around the corner and through the small flap in the door, it was sealed. He took a breath and forced his feet to move forward, away from the path and toward the hut. Shaking, he raised his fist and knocked on the door. Insides churning, he wondered what fate would await him at the other end, what vile curses would she cast upon him, what torture, or would she simply kill him where he stood? But he had no time to imagine more horrors, because the door creaked open. He braced himself and saw an old woman. She was dressed strangely, but she was not ugly or terrifying like in the tales, with red eyes and black fingers. Only old, maybe even in better shape than some of the elders in his village. "What do you want?" she said impatiently. "Or did you come all this way to gawk silently?" He opened his mouth, closed it to clear his throat, and tried again. "I need your help." He cringed internally at the fresh reminder of his mousy voice. The witch squinted at him for a moment, then turned away and waved him in. "Very well," she sighed. "Let's see what you've got." He hesitated for a moment before following her through the doorframe, and she looked back at him impatiently. "Well, come on. I'm not going to eat you." She looked him over, her nose wrinkling. "You're too skinny anyway." He followed her in, and couldn't tell if she was joking, but hoped not to stay long enough to find out. "What help do you require?" the witch asked, stroking her cat that had jumped onto the table before turning her attention to some dried plants. He started, his words shaky. "I need a spell to change my voice." "To?" she prompted, not looking away from her task. "To... so that I like it," he offered weakly. "Humph," she grunted, and took a breath, finally turning to face him. "I suppose I can do that." He felt a burst of light in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling greeting him like a friend. Hope. "I'll need something from you, too. Spells don't grow on trees, you know." His heart dropped again, and his hand wandered to his necklace as he thought, rubbing it to calm himself. He was so stupid. How could he have forgotten to bring something to offer? The witch's narrow gaze followed his hand. "Well, what have you got there?" He looked down dumbly at the necklace he wore every day like he had never seen it before. He clutched it momentarily, then took it off and held it out on his palm. His chest felt strange without the familiar weight, but it would be a small sacrifice if the witch could do what she said. He only hoped it would be enough. "It's my favorite rock. I found it when I was a child. It had a perfect hole in it, so I made it into a necklace, and I haven't taken it off since." The witch nodded slowly as she listened, then sharply once. "I suppose it'll do." She swiped it off his hand without touching him, and turned to the other side of the room that had a big cauldron, roiling and bubbling and steaming with deep colors sinking and floating in and out of view. She reached beyond it and took a small cauldron the size of his head from the shelf, clearing some space and placing it on the table. He hesitated before turning away from the big one. "You don't need that one?" She glanced at him, then to the hissing liquid, waving him away. "Of course not. Listen," she spoke as she started picking ingredients out of cabinets and off walls and adding them to the pot. "Men have come from all sorts of places and asked for spells that would require a cauldron the size of my house. You have a small request, so you get a small pot. Any objections?" He shook his head and added, "No," when she didn't see, focused on the task at hand. As she worked, he wondered if he should have asked for something bigger. But no, why would he? There was nothing else he wanted more, and besides, perhaps his little rock wouldn't have been payment enough then. What have other people asked for? She raised a hairy eyebrow at him, then returned to the pot, turning on the fire under it with a snap of her fingers that made him jump. "What happened to the little boy who could barely get a word out?" she grumbled, mashing something with the pestle. "That is not for me to share, and definitely not for you to hear." He nodded, but his mind was stuck on what she said before. Little wasn't great, but boy. How did this witch he'd just met know him better than the people in his village who'd seen him all his life? He was starting to doubt those stories he'd heard countless times, because here she was making him a spell in exchange for a rock, and not dicing him up and shoving him in her oven. but he couldn't think on it much, excitement jittering his bones. He tried to peer over her shoulder, but she blocked his view. He waited as she worked and found himself looking around her hut. It was filled to the brim with all sorts of bits and bobs, food ingredients and other ingredients, plants and herbs and preserved animal parts and preserved things he could not identify, in lots and lots of jars and sealed containers on shelves upon cabinets and the like. He pet the black cat and smiled as she purred, scratching her behind the ears. When he was about to kneel to pet her better, the witch blew on the pot with a bellows and the cat jumped down and patted away. He straightened up, suddenly nervous again. Finally he could see what she had been working on, as the witch skimmed off the lavender foam to reveal a deep purple and blue and faintly green mixture. She scooped out a leaf with a spoon and slowly waved the steam away with her hand. "Is it done?" he ventured nervously. "It needs to cool," she answered shortly. As she tended to the brew, he found himself awkwardly waiting in the house, having explored all he could with his eyes. He opened his mouth to ask a question, like why she chose to live in the dark forest or how she learned to be a witch, but thought better of it and shut his mouth before she could see his curiosity. After what seemed like forever, she poured the potion into a large bowl and placed it on the table, gesturing him to sit. "Drink." He dutifully did as told, raising the bowl to his lips and drinking deeply, heart pounding as he emptied the burning liquid into his stomach. When he had cleaned the bowl, he set it down and took a breath, mind buzzing and flipping over itself with nervousness. The witch had turned her back to him and was cleaning and organizing her supplies. He quietly cleared his throat and tried, "Thank you," but hot embarrassment ripped through his body. He sounded exactly the same as before, and the apparentness of the pitch of his voice was even more severe now that he expected something different. "Did it work?" He hated the shakiness of his words. She shot him a look. "Do you doubt my magic?" "No, no," he said quickly, not because he truly didn't, but because he was terrified of the witch. She huffed, as if seeing right through him. "Change does not happen instantly, little boy." "How long—" "Patience!" he startled back. "When the seasons have gone through their cycles, you will find what you seek." His heart dropped. An entire year? He should be grateful, but he felt the aching of the desire to be fixed, after what all he had gone through to get here. But he supposed he couldn't complain. He really could not. The words were fear-barred from his mouth. So he nodded. "Thank you." He wanted to call her something, but witch sounded mean now that she had done him a favor. But she waved him away. "Any visitor is a brief reprieve from the repetition of the forest. You have been fairly acceptable, but it is time for you to go." He nodded again, not having gotten the idea that he was acceptable to her at all, but just as he was about to place his hand on the doorknob, he paused and turned back. His quiet voice cracked. "Do you have something that will help me get back to the village? I don't have anything else to give, though." She rolled her eyes as she bent down to a bottom drawer and took out what looked like a tiny sunflower, the size of his finger. Not a daisy or a dandelion, but a tiny sunflower. "Go back the way you came, then follow the direction the flower points, and you will find your way out of the forest. Now shoo!" Not one to argue, he fled without a glance back at the hut, the clearing, the shadows closing behind him as he followed the pale flower back to the village. The shadows grew and grew until they enveloped him too, and he could see stars peeking through the gaps in the leafy roof. He held his bravery out in front of him, and followed the flower as it pointed. No thoughts reached his mind as he walked and walked until in a sudden step he was free from the woods, and saw the distant lantern glow of his village. Letting out a breath the weight of 1,000, the flower crumbled to dust and he sprinted towards his home. He waited, and it was a different kind of torture. But the end of the season eventually came, and with it left the dread that the witch's spell had no effect. His voice began to crack and change, and it felt like the time he had dropped a stone, and when it broke, the inside revealed sparkling gems. As the weather grew hot and buzzing, he was overwhelmed with the joy of the beginning of his new voice. He started to sound like the young boy he was instead of a child, and after that the momentous cracks of a boy coming into age. One day, when bravery he thought he had long left in the woods caught up with him, he opened his mouth to sing. It was his sacred pastime, one of the few things that brought him joy, and the sound that emerged was a rusty metal spike through his chest. He cleared his throat and tried again, but it was the worst singing he had ever heard from his own mouth. The notes simply weren't pretty. He sounded crackly and scratchy and somehow off-tempo too. Dread filled him from feet to jaw, and in a moment's panic he wondered if his singing voice was gone forever, if the rock really wasn't enough and the witch had taken it as well in exchange for the spell. The thought made his breathing quicken, but he shoved it away. He couldn't send his hope to the gallows for one ugly crime, and he reminded himself that it had not nearly been as long as the witch had told, not even halfway. Like anything good, it needed time to grow and ripen and come into itself, and as long as he had waited, he supposed he could stand to wait more. Although it stung, it was more the prick of a thorn or needle than the dagger through his chest, for the hope dulled the knife to an ache that he hoped against hope would soon become a memory. When the weather started to change again and the heat was not so blinding, his voice was decidedly boy, but it still sounded scratchy and odd, like walking on gravel. A part of him couldn't even be bothered to care because people did not hesitate to call him boy now. He was still struck with amazement at how easy it came to them now that one simple thing as his voice was different, and the thought even made him a little angry, but anger was quickly burned away by joy, a happiness that started inside and glowed his face and skin so his friends commented on his growing confidence. The wonder of no longer feeling horrible and disgusted by speaking or being talkative, as his nature declared, was a feeling of floating and being alive. His friends, of course, were all glad he finally found his voice, but his closest friend was the only one who believed his tale about the witch and the spell. He could live with that. It didn't really matter if they knew the whole story, because the truth that was emerging was undeniable. At first he did not notice the roughness in his voice, let alone care, because he was so excited that he sounded right, for the first time sounded like himself. But then he noticed he did not sing nearly as much now. It used to be nearly every moment alone, but he found there were days upon days where it simply did not come to mind. It must be that partly it did not bring him as much joy anymore, for the reminder of the loss of the skill he had collected over his entire life was too painful. As the leaves turned and fell from the trees and his voice became deeper and steadier, he could not resist that constant desire to make music from nothing, and he tried to sing more and more often. When the times came that someone appeared and heard him, strangely he did not feel embarrassed the same. Not that it did not sound like him, but that it did not sound pleasing. For as his confidence grew and his voice became louder, he never wished to disturb anyone's peace. So he tried and tried more, and somewhere along the line it turned from trying to doing. His voice was not such a surprise to himself, so as the change slowed he was allowed to find familiarity and comfort in these new sounds. Before the witch, he had never imagined that he would want his voice to reach higher, but now that those notes he had once reached so easily were unattainable, he felt a sort of loss, a loss not common in feeling, like the death of someone you did not particularly like, but saw every day. But like the carving of stone by the river, or the motions that built his muscle, his voice came back to him, new and old, loud and quiet and solid and free. And same as the carving of a riverbed, it was impossible to watch the change by sitting on the shore, only witnessed by becoming the ground and living and feeling. And, of course, by someone coming by after generations and noting on a map how the shape is different. So it is his friend comments, both of them sitting on a jutting stone among the grass. Do you think that cloud kind of looks like a sunflower? As those words left her mouth, he was reminded of the witch for the first time in the moon cycle. It almost didn't feel real, his encounter with the witch, but the evidence was carried with the breeze. I think so. His voice sounded soft and hard like the wind, and he felt a little selfish for loving it so much. But he could not fault anyone else for feeling this kind of joy, so he would not bar himself from it. I wonder how the witch is doing, he mused, for this was the only person who believed his tale. I hope she's well, his friend smiled into the sky. I wish I could thank her. He tilted his head. Why? She had not been granted a spell. She glanced at him from the clouds. Because I'm really glad you like your voice now. His face warmed and he was glad she was looking up, though he wasn't sure why. Me too. Would you sing? He jolted, but she was still ever calmly gazing into the sky. He knew she had heard him sing, probably many a time by now, but it had never occurred to him that she had paid attention or formed an opinion or liked it. Yet finding no reason to object, he cleared his throat. At the beginning it was a little wobbly, him not being used to purposely giving his voice to another's ears, but soon it was apparent that it was no different from what he always did, what he loved to do. His voice was ever so scratchy, yet for some reason, maybe perhaps because it was born of a gift, he didn't much mind it. As the weather came and kept coming, he sang and kept singing. He noted improvement. He was regaining his high range as he got to know the new lows. The notes are fine and even moments of lovely, and his tempo is good, but his voice no less rough as dry stones. The snow came and melted in the new season, and only when the flowers were in full bloom and the breeze was warm did he remember it had been a whole year's cycle since he went to see the witch. Now that he liked his voice, he could want people to hear him sing, but he found that he did not, because his voice was no longer beautiful. It is a good thing, he reminded himself. He would never want to go back to the way it was before. So why was the hurt coming back? despite what his friend said, and he still had a disquieting suspicion that she liked his voice because it was attached to the rest of him. He found he did not fully believe she thought it was beautiful, for she had not said so, and even more, no one else had since his voice had changed. It had been a blessing at first, the melting of the cursed bonds of that word, and he had been grateful to be rid of it. Like a vengeful and desperate spirit, that word had clung to him and haunted him when he most wanted it to disappear. But now that it was sealed in stone that his voice was no longer beautiful, and no one would call it as such, he found that he longed for the curse that he would now call a gift. He longed for it, not for anyone else to call him such, but himself only, and felt that only when he truly believed it, he would be healed. This was supposed to fix everything. By now, as the witch's words, he should have found what he sought. What had he sought, all those seasons ago? He wasn't quite sure. A voice that fit how he felt inside, he had surely found that. So why did he still feel like an unfinished painting, some piece, some aspect missing? As if a lovely voice would make him complete, make him whole. No, that wasn't right. It wasn't fair that all he had gone through had led to this feeling. He could not go on like this. He could go on. He had found what he sought. He was sure of it. So on he goes with his life, continuing to sing, and every time it sounded more grating than the last, and as it continued, scraped uncomfortably not only on his throat, but his soul, grinding down until when he walked, the dust of his heart was left behind in the dirt. He tried to go on, truly tried to be at peace, but he felt a greedy urge creep up inside him. He thought about the witch again and again every day, and every night lying awake until the thought haunted him so much he could barely sleep. Could she fix me again? Like the craving of a fruit out of season, the taste of desire crashed over him and threw him to the ground. She had fixed him once. She had spells, magic. His potion was of little consequence to her before. What would another one be? But along with that, a nasty thought emerged, that the witch had done the spell perfectly, and the problem was with him. He should have done something differently, used his words differently, been different. How naive of him that everything would be fixed by one change. But it was better, truthfully. He would never go back, not for anything. It was too much. It was all too much. The thought swarmed and buzzed in his mind like angry wasps in a nest he could not see, until he found himself facing the forest at that same house on the edge of the village. His breathing came heavy and fast, and the shadows seemed to grow towards him, beckoning him in, capturing his mind and the edges of his vision. He ran towards the forest, and crashed through the line of trees, finding that same path that had led to the hut and the clearing that housed the witch which had changed his life. He walked the path, walked the forest, for hours upon hours, until he was sure he should have reached the witch now, and then far past. Fear started to creep into his limbs, and he used all his bravery and strength to keep them steady, pushing down the urge to run like a frightened animal. But as he walked with no one but the trees to accompany him, they began to appear sinister, black eyes peering at him from the dark, prickling his skin like bugs. Every sound out of the ordinary made him whip around and scan with wild eyes, but again there was nothing. Not a single soul, not animal or human he could see. And after this went on and on, he found that his feet had lost the path. He was surrounded by looming trees that could not care less whether he lived or died in these woods, in fact probably leaned toward death as he would make good food for their roots. The only sounds he could hear were the distant chirping of birds, the whispering of the leaves, and his own 2 loud breaths. He tried to find the path again, retracing his steps, but the forest was much too thick, seemed denser than before, so he decided the only path would be to forge on. Despite the pricking of fear bugs on his skin and the growing dread that tightened his throat, he kept going, hoping that he had not made a terrible mistake and his friends did not hear the last of him that day when he went into the woods and was finally shown that the rest of the tales were true as he was ripped to pieces by a monstrous beast. When the last dusty rays of dusk were fading, and at long last he thought to himself, "This is how I shall die," the witch's hut finally came into view. His heart leaped and his breath left his lungs. Without a moment's hesitation, he crossed the clearing and knocked on her door, and after a few long stretching moments, it creaked open. Suddenly his tribulations were of no matter, because he made it here, and everything would be good now. The witch was turned away from him, muttering to herself words he did not care to decipher. "I need your help." He uttered those words again. She grunted, glancing at him from the corner of her eye while picking something off a shelf. And what help would that be? "I need a spell to change my voice again." At that, the witch's movements all stopped, and she snapped her head to him in a way that made him start. "Why?" she asked, cold and biting as a winter wind. He swallowed, gathering his courage. My singing is no longer beautiful. Do you like it? He hesitated. I... Do you like your voice? Her question came as a spat statement, still not moving from her position. Well, yes, but... Now she turned the rest of her body to face him. You asked me for a spell that would give you a voice you liked, not one that would please everyone else. She advanced, and he took a step back. But... He felt his heart was not behind his argument, yet the words kept spilling out. Isn't there anything at all? No! She sounded angry now, not just annoyed. You cannot reverse a spell, or overlay it with another spell on the same subject. You could end up with what you started with, or worse, or no voice at all. Now get out! She gestured with her ladle, splattering him with a foreign orange liquid. Get out! Without another word, he scurried from the hut and back the way he came, and his heart was racing so hard he did not even stop to notice the path had found him again. As he followed the trail toward the village, his heart slowed, but he couldn't think of any more of the witch's words until he was back home. And then, when he was safe, he still could not, because he was too afraid. A full moon cycle passed without him daring to open his mouth to sing. He stood alone in the grassy fields next to his village. Despite the warming weather, a cold wind bit at his ears. He felt the familiar sting of tears climb up his throat like a thorny vine, pricking at his eyes and threatening to spill. He inhaled a shaky breath, feeling foolish. He loved his voice, he truly did, and was eternally grateful to the witch for giving him everything he ever wanted. So why did it still hurt so much? He opened his mouth to sing, but the only sound that emerged was a pathetic breath. He let out the rest of the heavy exhale and fell to his knees on the ground, clutching his body and squeezing his eyes shut tight, praying for the pain to pass. But it penetrated his body, submerging him and drowning him so his only thoughts were noises and the begging for it to stop. But his breaths were too fast, heart too loud. How could something that brought him unknowable joy also cause such agonizing torture? He heard someone approach. The jolt of embarrassment shocked him back to real life, and his hands moved to wipe away his tears when he realized they had flooded from his eyes. But as his hands wiped and wiped, the wetness only spread across his face and hands. He sniffled and gave up, dropping his head. His friend came near and kneeled beside him, glancing at his undoubtedly splotchy face, then looking to the ground as he did. Can you tell me what's bothering you? How to begin? His friend was the only one who believed his tale of the forest and the witch, he thought. Everyone else had agreed he was simply the last flower to bloom, he heard them whisper behind his back. No magic to be seen, and he had made it all up for attention. He did not push his truth. His voice was so raw, like untrodden dirt. I cannot sing any more. That's not true. He sharply turned to her, and her expression was determined, almost offended. You have a beautiful voice. He shook his head, but that word didn't mean anything now. It's not true. Not anymore. He loved his voice, but it was decidedly not beautiful. Do you not trust me? Now he was the one offended. I trust you more than anyone else in the world. She took his damp hands in hers and gripped them tightly. Then trust me when I say I love your singing. He hesitated, eyes downcast at their clasped hands. But the other boys who sing. She shook her head violently. I do not care about them. I would rather listen to you. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to so badly it hurt. But this hurt was not stronger than the one that had rooted deep in his chest. Why? He asked weakly. She thought for a moment. Because it is yours, she said decidedly. Because no one has a voice like you. Because it reminds me of summer grass and river stones and the setting sun. His face warmed, and if his hands were not occupied, he would have hid his face behind them. She said his name, and his shoulders lowered ever so slightly, and his breathing was ever so easier. And most of all because it makes you happier than I've ever seen you. She smiled, and he returned it, wiping the last dampness from his face. Please do not give up singing. You are so much happier when you do. He did not know how he had forgotten this, how he had needed a reminder of what he loved. She waited a breath before speaking. I know something that might help. She handed him a warm cup, and as he sipped, he wondered if the witch had also put love as one of the ingredients in her changing potion. The liquid warmed his throat and spread through his chest. At dusk, when the brightest stars were just waking, at the top of a rocky hill near the village, he sang to his friend. She loved his voice because it was true, and so he had no choice but to love it too. He is one of the skilled hunters, and every day he follows the path he made in the forest to visit the hut of the woman who believed herself into being a witch. They drink tea, and he sings to her in his rough voice, and in return she gives him a little sunflower which guides him back home in the dark. There he places a stone with a perfect little hole on a path near the village for a young girl who sounds like a boy.